Hey everyone, my name is Xavier Lumley. And this is my research presentation for our research essay that we have for regulation theories and practices. So before we begin, I would like to acknowledge that we are situated on Noongar land and we pay our respects to elders past, present and future. On to the assignment. For this project, I have chosen to pursue a topic related to risk regulation in the health sector. Having chosen to discuss a field that has gathered significant domestic and international attention over recent years due to its hotly debated nature and represents an ongoing shift in several nations in how they tackle harms associated with illegal drug use and represents new challenges in both domestic and international regulation. So the background, which I'll expand on the next slide, indicates a shift from criminalization to harm minimization policies across several countries. As it stands, cannabis is both treated as a criminal and medical product, depending on what jurisdiction you're in, even in the same country sometimes. So for this assignment, we are operating on the assumption that Australia is more likely than not to eventually legalize cannabis for recreational use. So the research assignment seeks to ask, in a hypothetical world of partial international cannabis legalization and shipping of cannabis as a health and recreational product, what challenges in conceiving and managing risk exist for the Therapeutic Goods Administration? Some background on this topic. There has been significant change in cannabis laws across numerous jurisdictions since about 2012. Beginning with Colorado and Washington states legalizing cannabis for recreational use, numerous states followed suit. So with 11 US states have their own respective legalized regulatory regimes existing within the federal system that still classifies cannabis as an illegal substance. So outside of the US, there were further changes with Uruguay and Canada legalizing recreational cannabis use. United Kingdom and Australia have both legalized cannabis use for medicinal purposes. And in New Zealand, interestingly enough, they're going to be holding a vote on this issue later this year in 2020 as a part of a power sharing arrangement between the New Zealand and Greens and New Zealand Labour Party. So, as mentioned previously, the shift has multiple explanations depending on where you are. There is not one singular shared rationale for legalizing cannabis. Those rationales are heavily dependent on the historical context as well as the weight placed behind the belief in the free enterprise and performance of prospective criminal justice systems. So, for example, legalizing cannabis in the US has been tied to a narrative regarding the failure of the criminal justice system, especially when you incorporate America's history of grossly overpopulated prisons, often filled with young black men who were caught with a little bit of cannabis. Overall, the aim of my paper is to analyze how the TGA deals with the growing exploitation of cannabis products to international buyers and the potential for a sizable import market, and how that can be reconciled with the domestic interest of ensuring Australian health and safety. I will examine how this infant system might deal with cannabis products in their basic flower form that are to be consumed for recreational purposes compared to the pill forms that exist currently in Australia. As this paper is fundamentally about risk, the paper will reflect this by being selective in its themes that you can read there. So the research potentials into examining the somewhat taboo subject are plentiful. The fact that the subject is quickly evolving as respective industries become more situated, comfortable with existing regulation, and seek to expand their businesses. Personally, as someone who has previously written about drug policies purely in a domestic nature, the inclusion of transnational factors and organizations feels almost like a frontier regulatory problem. And the fact that free trade nations can have widely different domestic drug policies nearly seems like an inherent contradiction and interesting dynamic to investigate. And this disconnect between two trade-friendly countries may raise its head and illustrate the domestic considerations in developing consensus-based regulatory regimes. For example, in Canada, when creating their own cannabis framework, there was a strong focus on health outcomes. Canada, in their policy, while having market-based appreciations in growing an industry, is primarily focused on ensuring good health outcomes for their citizens. So this translates to strict rules on advertising cannabis products, limits on public use, strong involvement of psychiatric community, and other mechanisms meant to discourage excessive use and assist individuals dependent on cannabis. Conversely, if you see what's occurring in some US states, there is a different focus, which typically falls into two categories: less minorities in jail or economic growth. So With the growing trend of cannabis legalization, I predict that sometime in the future, these differing focuses of cannabis regulation will translate to a competition of interest between states themselves. Specifically, with Australia's own health-based attitude towards cannabis currently, questions will be raised how the TGA handles this very specific product. Important factors in developing this paper that would require special attention in order to answer my research question thoroughly includes things such as how the TGA already operates in the current medicinal cannabis scheme will be an important consideration and may provide a guide for how the TGA could handle the same product except for a recreational market. What specific information and behavioral instruments will be the TGA utilize in order to regulate the growing, retailing, and consuming of cannabis in order to pursue its end goals of regulation? And should those end goals be focused on eliminating certain risks, such as market inefficiencies to support economic growth, or would the TGA care more about ensuring problem users, whom coincidentally would also be the biggest source of revenue for any recreational retailer, receive the support and help over being able to actively buy as much cannabis as they want? And in conducting preliminary research for this assignment, it appears very evident that the public-private relationship will constitute a significant portion of the research focus and discussion. I find this part to be particularly interesting, considering that the possibility of overlap between legitimate and illegitimate cannabis businesses. It's not far-fetched, for example, to imagine that if a man has been growing cannabis in Australia for decades illegally, then perhaps that individual can offer immense insight into user habits, technical and specialist knowledge around growing and cultivating cannabis that could be beneficial to regulators who are probably not that involved in weed growing. But the interactions between private and public raise many interesting ideas, such as illegal regulatory capture, in which regulators are knowingly or unknowingly engaging with organized crime in order to develop regulation. Here, I will briefly discuss how some of the literature in this paper will play out. As this research question asks how the TGA would respond to the risks of this hypothetical but very possible scenario, we can take great solace that numerous other similar organizations have had to already deal with this. We can actively engage Canadian and American regulation to provide some short comparative law analysis. It is fortunate for my research that these existing regulations exist within jurisdictions with very similar political economies, making it a bit easier to perform some policy transplant analysis. Research will also prioritize assessing what kind of health-based risks exist in relation to cannabis usage. So while there are many articles written that speak to the harms of legal and non-legal cannabis markets in relation to such things as environmental impact and criminal justice implications, we will confine ourselves to health-based risks of cannabis. So things like harms related to mental illness, quality of cannabis, rules for reselling, essentially anything that the TGA would be responsible for regulating. While a focus of secondary sources is prevalent within the article, there is some degree of primary research being attempted. As of recording this, I have reached out to Penny Gleeson, a Melbourne University academic, who among other things has written about the TGA and cannabis. And I've also contacted a firm known as Little Green Pharma, which is one of the only medicinal cannabis firms currently operating in Australia. I'm hoping to speak with someone from the firm to discuss their relationship with the TGA and also inquire about a large export of medicinal cannabis that was recently received to the UK market. So a brief outline of my essay structure. Essentially, my plan is to first break down the concept of minimizing risks in legalized cannabis regimes and what is entailed. Then once it's been well established what the competing factors are between nations, I can delve into how these transnational factors work while discussing how the underpinning theoretical framework and reliance on epistemic authority may contribute or negate the development of risk regulation. Once done, I'll be able to make recommendations on best practice and to be able to make recommendations about how the TGA might fulfill their function, while also highlighting issues in my research method and limitations. So quickly, before I finish, I just want to outline that I am pro-legalization and I'm Australian born and raised. So these will bring limitations to my perspective and we have to be mindful of them when I'm writing about foreign country policies and my own attitudes towards legalization. Aside from that, I thank you very, very much for listening. If you have any constructive feedback, I'd love to hear it. And yeah, good luck everyone.